She didn't know who she was calling. All she knew was that the room was shrinking, the door was locked, and the man in front of her didn't need to raise his voice to threaten. His voice was a whisper, cold as a knife to the throat. A random call, an anonymous number. 12 minutes later, Chicago was engulfed in gunfire. If you're watching this story, hit like now and comment the name of the city you're watching. I want to know how far my story has come. And don't turn off the video, because the worst is yet to come. The rain came down hard that Tuesday night, the kind that didn't care about umbrellas or awnings or the thin jacket Sienna Vale had been wearing for 3 winters straight. It hit the sidewalk on South Wabash like it had a grudge, pooling fast in the cracks between old brick and older asphalt, and the neon from the Velvet Room sign bled red and gold across the wet street in jagged, trembling streaks that made everything look like a wound that wouldn't close. Sienna was 24 years old, and she was tired in the way that didn't go away with sleep. She'd been working double shifts at the Velvet Room for 11 months, every Friday and Saturday night, plus Wednesday through Thursday, which in practice meant every night except Sunday when the place was closed, and she lay on her mattress on the floor of her apartment on Cermak and stared at the water stain on the ceiling and thought about California. She thought about it the same way a person stranded in a desert thinks about water. Not as a real thing, as a concept, as proof that the world contained better things even if those things were very far away and required money she didn't have. The Velvet Room was the kind of jazz lounge that had been dying slowly for about 15 years and hadn't quite had the decency to finish. The stage was real, the musicians were real, and on a good night the saxophone player named Earl could make the whole room feel like it was 1962 and everything was still possible. But the walls were water-damaged behind the velvet draping, the ice machine broke every other week, and the owner, a Croatian man named Dobrovic who came in twice a month to count receipts and drink for free, hadn't put money into the place since Obama's first term. The clientele was what kept it alive. Politicians who did not want to be seen at nicer places, gamblers between games, men in expensive suits who paid cash and tipped in consistently, and sometimes looked at Sienna the way a person looks at something they're deciding whether to buy. She hated the job with a specific, detailed hatred. She hated the way the tray edge bruised her wrist after 4 hours. She hated the way cigarette smoke soaked into her hair no matter how she tied it back. She hated the way certain men said sweetheart and meant it as a statement of ownership rather than affection. But she was good at it. She moved fast and she remembered orders, and she didn't spill and she didn't flinch when someone grabbed her arm to flag her down, and she didn't cry in the bathroom more than once per shift, which in her experience was a professional standard most people couldn't meet. The night it happened was a Wednesday, late October, the kind of cold that hadn't fully arrived yet but was making its intentions clear. She'd been on since 5 and it was close to midnight when Danny, the floor manager, came and found her near the service bar with a face that told her something was wrong before he opened his mouth. "Caruso's in the back," he said. He said it quietly. He said it the way you say, "There's a fire" or "Don't move." Sienna set her tray down carefully. "Why?" "He asked for you specifically." "I don't know Vincent Caruso." Danny looked away. "He knows you." She stood still for a moment. The room was 3/4 full around her, blue lit and smoky, Earl working through a slow number on the stage, ice clinking, voices low. Normal night, normal sounds. And somewhere behind the door marked private. At the end of the hall, a man was waiting for her who she didn't know but whose name she recognized because her brother had said it once, on the phone 6 weeks ago, in a voice she'd never heard from him before. "I'm in some trouble, Sienna. Nothing I can't handle." She should have pushed harder. She knew that now. She took her apron off, folded it over the bar edge, and walked toward the back. The office was small, and it smelled like old leather and something chemical underneath, like cleaning product used to cover something worse. There was a desk with nothing on it, 2 chairs, and a lamp throwing everything in amber shadow. 3 men stood along the walls, not moving, not talking, just there the way furniture is there. And Vincent Caruso sat in the chair facing the door with his legs crossed and his hands folded in his lap, like a man who had all the time in the world. He was 50 or close to it, gray at the temples. The suit was well cut and dark blue. His shoes were so polished they reflected the lamplight in 2 small yellow smears. His face was the kind of face that had probably been handsome once, and now just looked expensive in the way that certain old things look expensive, because someone had paid a lot over a long time to maintain them, and the maintenance itself was visible. He didn't smile when she came in. He just looked at her the way you look at something you already own. "Close the door," he said. One of the men behind her did it. Sienna heard the lock turn. She stood in the center of the room and looked at Caruso and kept her chin level. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest, but she'd worked in rooms like this long enough to know that showing fear early was a mistake you couldn't walk back. "I don't know you," she said. "You know my name." "My brother mentioned it." "Your brother borrowed $40,000 from me." Caruso said it without inflection, the way you state a weather fact. "He borrowed it in August. He was supposed to return it, with interest, by the 1st of October. Today is October 22nd. "I'm not my brother." "No," Caruso agreed. "You're not." He tilted his head slightly. "Your brother is also not currently available, which creates a situation." Something cold moved through her. "What does that mean?" "It means the debt transfers." He unfolded his hands slowly. "It means you are now responsible for what Mason owes." "I'm a waitress," Sienna said. "I don't have $40,000. "I know." He said it almost gently. "That's why we're restructuring the arrangement." He let the pause breathe, timed it carefully, the way practiced men time silences to maximize the impact of what follows. "You'll work for me. Directly. Not here. In operations I'll specify. Until the debt is cleared." She understood what he meant. The word operations was doing a lot of work in that sentence. "No," she said. The room didn't react. None of the men moved. Caruso just looked at her. "I want you to understand something," he said quietly. "I'm not asking." "I heard you." Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "The answer is still no." Caruso stood slowly. He was taller than he'd looked sitting down. He moved toward her with that particular unhurried ease that certain dangerous men have. Not aggressive, not hurried, just inexorable, like a tide. He stopped close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and cold, and looked at her with those dead calm eyes. "Your brother is alive," he said. "For now. That condition has variables." She held herself very still. "Work for me," he said, "or the variables change." Outside the office door, Earl was playing something slow and mournful, the notes drifting through the wall like smoke, and the bass player was keeping a heartbeat underneath it all, steady and low, and the club sounds continued completely indifferent to what was happening in this small locked room, and Sienna felt the full weight of her situation land on her all at once. The locked door, the three men, the absence of any name in her phone she could call who wouldn't make this worse, the $40,000 she didn't have. Her brother's voice saying nothing I can't handle, in that tone that meant he was already in over his head and lying about it. She had left California as a concept, and now even that was gone. Her right hand was in her apron pocket. Habit. She kept her phone there when she worked. Her thumb found the screen by touch. Mason had taken her phone 2 weeks ago to update some app, and she'd noticed afterward that her contacts looked different, lighter, fewer. And she'd asked him about it, and he'd said he hadn't done anything, which was the exact thing he said when he had done something. Half her contacts were gone. She'd been meaning to restore them from the cloud backup, and hadn't gotten around to it. She had almost no one in her recent calls. Her thumb scrolled up, feeling for anything, anybody. There was a number near the top, no name attached. She didn't recognize it. It had appeared in her recent calls 11 days ago, and she had no memory of dialing it or receiving a call from it. Maybe a misdial, maybe something Mason had done. She didn't know. Unknown. Just a number. Caruso was still watching her. She'd been quiet long enough that he thought she was calculating surrender. He started to say something else. Sienna pressed the number. She didn't raise the phone. Kept it low and angled, in the fold of her arm and her body, screen down. The sound was barely there. She pressed her wrist against her apron to muffle it further. 1 ring, 2. She kept her eyes on Caruso's face, kept her expression neutral, kept breathing. A click. A deep voice, precise and unhurried, with the particular quality of a person accustomed to calls at any hour. Yes. She couldn't respond directly. Caruso was 4 feet away. She turned her head slightly, like she was looking at the floor, and kept her voice at the edge of a breath. Please, hurry! Caruso frowned. He hadn't heard the call connect, hadn't heard the ring, hadn't seen the phone. What did you... Who is this? The voice in the phone was sharper now. She angled her wrist, said it quieter than almost nothing. Please. They're going to kill me. Silence on the line. A second of it, maybe 2. Then something changed in the voice. She felt it more than heard it, a kind of drop in temperature, a compression, like a vast thing becoming focused. Address. Caruso stepped toward her. Are you on the phone? She barely moved her lips. Velvet Room, South Wabash. He grabbed her wrist and turned it and saw the phone, and his face shifted from controlled to furious in one clean movement. He took the phone from her hand and looked at the screen, and something moved across his features. Confusion, then contempt. No name, he said. He turned the screen toward her. You called a number with no name? He almost laughed. Who answers a call like that? He dropped the phone on the desk and looked at his men and made a gesture with 2 fingers. Hold her until I figure out what to do with the brother. 2 of the men moved toward her. Sienna pressed herself back against the wall and thought, 12 minutes. She didn't know why that number came to her. It just did. A feeling, not a fact. 12 minutes, and something changes or nothing changes, and either way you have to breathe until then. The man named Caruso sat back down and straightened his cuffs with great precision. Nobody's coming for you, he said calmly. You called a ghost. You get to sit here until I decide the rest of this evening's business. He looked at the floor, then back at her, with the detached patience of a man who had waited out many things. Try not to be difficult. Sienna said nothing. She pressed her back against the cold plaster wall, felt the 2 men settle into positions on either side of her like brackets, and she watched the seconds move and thought about Mason's voice in California and the specific way Earl played the saxophone when he thought nobody was really listening, loose and a little mournful and honest in the way music can be when it's not trying to impress anyone. 7 minutes passed. Then the sound reached them, not immediately identifiable as anything specific. First, it was just a change in the quality of the noise from the club floor, a shift in register, lower and sharper, and then suddenly multiple things at once: furniture, glass, voices changing from conversation to panic. Caruso looked up. One of his men opened the office door, and the sound flooded in fuller, screaming now, and something heavier underneath, concussive, and then unmistakably, gunfire, close, fast, multiple weapons. The man at the door turned back and said one word, Moretti. The color left Caruso's face the way water leaves a tipped glass. Complete. Immediate. That's not... He stopped, looked at Sienna. That's not possible. Sienna said nothing. She felt something move through her chest that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite fear, and wasn't quite anything she had a name for. Something ancient and cellular, like a body recognizing a change in weather before the mind catches up. The sound of the office door splintering came 2 seconds before the door itself did. It came apart at the frame. Not the lock, the whole frame, like something of considerable force had simply decided the door was no longer a meaningful concept. 2 men entered first, moving low and fast, and the 3 men in the room with Caruso made their decisions quickly and incorrectly, and the room became very loud and then very quiet in a span of seconds that Sienna would later be unable to sequence correctly in memory. She pressed herself against the wall, and then he was in the doorway. Not large in the way that some men are large, not wide or muscle-heavy or performing physical dominance, just present in a way that reorganized the room around him. Black coat, dark suit beneath, a face that was sharp and still, the kind of still that isn't calm so much as controlled, a stillness that costs something to maintain. Gray eyes. They moved across the room fast and professionally and landed on Sienna. Something happened in his face when they did. Small, brief, gone in half a second. But she saw it. Vincent Caruso was on his feet against the far wall, and for the first time in the entire evening, Sienna saw him afraid. Not calculating afraid the way men like him are afraid of consequences or complications. Actually afraid. The kind that bypasses everything sophisticated in a person and reaches down to whatever is oldest and most animal. Damien, see, Caruso started, but this is a misunderstanding. The girl has nothing to do with, I know, the man said. His voice was the same voice from the phone. He crossed the room and stood in front of Sienna and looked at her for a moment. Not the way the men at the club looked at her, not measuring or calculating or shopping, just looking, like he was confirming something to himself. And then he said quietly, "Can you walk?" She realized her legs were shaking. She locked her knees and straightened. "Yes," she said. He nodded once and turned back to the room. And what happened next, Sienna didn't watch in full. She kept her eyes on the doorway, on the exit, on the strip of light from the hallway that represented the rest of the night, and the rest of whatever came after this. And she heard it, and she flinched at the sounds, but she kept her eyes forward and her chin up and her legs steady. And when a hand came into her peripheral vision, not grabbing, not demanding, just there, extended, an offer, she took it. Cold fingers, dry. He walked her out through what was left of the velvet room without hurrying, through broken glass and upended chairs, and the smell of gunpowder cutting through the residue of years of cigarettes and spilled bourbon, and Earl's saxophone was on its side on the stage, and the lamp behind the bar was still swinging from some impact, throwing light in slow arcs across the damage, and through the front entrance, where the rain was still coming down hard, machine gun hard, onto the black SUVs angled across South Wabash with their doors open and engines running. He let go of her hand at the car door. She stood in the rain for a second. He looked at her. "Get in." She looked back at the velvet room, at the neon sign still working, bleeding red gold across the wet street, at the door hanging crooked, at the smoke starting to drift through the broken windows. "My phone's in there. I'll get you a new one. There are pictures on it of my brother." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said something to one of his men in a low voice. The man went back inside. "Get in the car," he said again, "before the police arrive." She heard the sirens, distant but approaching, threading through the grid of Chicago streets toward them. She got in the car. The door closed. The interior was dark leather and silence. The rain hammered the roof. Through the tinted glass, she watched the city move past as the SUV pulled out. The wet street, the other cars angling away, a couple on a corner staring at their phones, a bus going by oblivious, Chicago in full indifferent motion, utterly unchanged by what had just happened in one small locked room on South Wabash. The man got in beside her. He was looking at his phone. His face was unreadable. Sienna sat in her thin jacket, damp from 30 seconds in the rain, and looked at her hands in her lap, and for the first time since Danny had come to find her at the bar, she allowed herself to feel how badly they were shaking. "You called me," he said. Not accusatory, just stating it. "I didn't know who you were," she said. "I know. I don't even know how your number was in my phone." He glanced at her. "Your brother, probably." He paused. "Mason Vale." She looked up sharply. "You know Mason?" "I know of him." He looked back at the window. "He took a phone from one of my men at a poker game about 3 months ago. Sold it, most likely. The number was still active in the device." She processed that, the accidental chain of it, the stupid, fragile, ridiculous accident of it. "I was going to hang up," she said. I didn't have a plan. I just—" She stopped. "I just needed someone to know." He said nothing. The SUV moved through a yellow light and turned north. "Why did you come?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Outside, the Chicago skyline was doing what it always did. Indifferent and enormous, lit up against the low clouds, all that glass and concrete that had survived everything and would survive whatever came next. "I don't know," he said finally. It was such a plain answer, she hadn't expected it. She looked at him, this man in his black coat with the gray eyes and the stillness that cost something, and she didn't know yet what his name meant to the city, didn't know what he'd built and what he'd destroyed and how many rooms like the one she'd just left existed because of decisions he had made over 20 years, didn't know any of that. She just knew his voice had changed when she said, "They're going to kill me," and that the change had come before any calculation, before any reason, and that 12 minutes later he had been standing in that doorway. She turned back to the window. The sirens were louder now, more of them, converging on South Wabash. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe." "I don't know you." "No. I don't know if I'm safer with you than I was back there." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You're not. Not necessarily." He said it without apology. "But you're alive, which is the first requirement." She thought about that. "What's your name?" she asked. Another pause. Shorter. "Damien Moretti." The name landed differently than she expected. Not as a name, as a fact. Like he'd told her the weather or the time. Something already true about the world that she'd simply not been informed of yet. She didn't know what it meant yet. Not fully. But somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part that was still processing the locked room and the gunfire and the door coming apart at the frame, something moved. Some small, cold rearrangement of the landscape. Because the way his man had said that name, Moretti, before the door gave way, in that flat, emptied-out voice, had told her something about the weight of it. And the way Caruso's face had changed when he heard it told her the rest. "Sienna Vale," she said. He looked at her once, briefly, then looked back at the road. The car moved north through the rain, deeper into the city, and behind them somewhere the police were finding what was left of the night on South Wabash. And ahead of them the lake was invisible in the dark, but present. The way large things are present, even when you can't see them. Sienna pressed her hands together in her lap to stop the shaking. She had called a number with no name, and a man had come. She didn't know yet what that cost. She didn't know yet what he would ask for in return, or whether there was a price, or what the shape of the next hours and days and weeks would look like, or whether Mason was alive, or whether alive was a condition that could be trusted to last. She only knew that the locked room was behind her now, and that the man sitting 2 feet away, who had driven through rain to a address on South Wabash because a stranger said please hurry on the phone, was the most dangerous thing she had ever been inside a car with, and that for some reason she could not name and did not trust, some reason that lived below thought, below calculation, below any instinct she'd been careful enough to develop. She was more afraid of what she was starting to feel than of anything that had happened tonight. The rain kept coming. Chicago kept moving, and somewhere across the city, in a conversation Sienna Vale didn't yet know about, a phone was ringing with information about her brother that would change everything she thought she understood about who had done what to whom, and why, and what came next. The penthouse was on the 38th floor of a building on North Lake Shore Drive that didn't have its name on the outside, which Sienna figured was probably intentional. The elevator required a key card and a code, and the recognition of at least one of the 2 men who rode up with them in silence. And when the doors opened directly into the living space, she stood at the threshold for a moment and took it in the way you take in something that reorders your sense of scale. Floor-to-ceiling glass on the north and east walls. Lake Michigan beyond, black and enormous. The kind of darkness that makes you understand why people used to think the world ended at the water's edge. The city lights reflected off the low cloud cover and cast everything in a pale amber glow that wasn't quite daylight and wasn't quite night. The furniture was sparse and expensive and looked like it had been chosen by someone who understood what things cost but wasn't interested in being comfortable. No softness anywhere, no throws or cushions or the accumulated small objects that make a space feel lived in. It felt like a command center that someone had installed a bed in. "Bathroom's at the end of the hall," Damien said. He'd already crossed to the kitchen island and was pouring 2 fingers of something into a glass without looking at her. "There are clothes in the second room. Take whatever fits." "Whose clothes?" "They were purchased for situations like this." She stood just inside the elevator threshold. "How often does this situation come up?" He drank. "Often enough." She came in fully and heard the elevator doors close behind her, and she crossed the space slowly, taking inventory, noting exits. The elevator, a door at the far left that probably led to stairs, a terrace door on the east wall currently latched. Old habit from working rooms full of men who thought money bought them options. "I want to know about my brother," she said. "In the morning. Now." He set the glass down on the counter with a small, precise click and looked at her. She'd seen that look before. Not threatening, not dismissive, just a look that belonged to men who were accustomed to being the terminal point of every decision in a room. The look that expected compliance without demanding it, because demand implied the possibility of refusal. "You've been in shock for 2 hours," he said. "You're still shaking. Whatever I tell you about Mason tonight, you'll hear wrong because your body is running on adrenaline and fear and whatever you had to eat 12 hours ago. You don't know that. You haven't stopped pressing your left thumb into your right palm since you got in the car." She looked down. She was doing it. She hadn't noticed. She made herself stop. "Tell me he's alive," she said. "Just that. Give me that much, and I'll wait for the rest." He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved in his face, not pity, something less comfortable than pity, something that suggested he was calculating how much truth the room could hold right now. "I don't know," he said. The two words landed separately. She felt the first one, and then the second one, and then the space between them. "What does that mean?" "It means I have people finding out." He picked up the glass again. "It means by morning, I'll have an answer." She stood in the middle of his living room in her waitress clothes, damp at the collar from the rain, and she understood that this was what it looked like when a powerful man told you the truth, when a lie would have been easier. It wasn't kind, it was just accurate. She went to find the bathroom. The mirror was unkind at 1 a.m. She looked at herself under fluorescent light. Mascara tracking down both cheeks, a bruise starting under her left wrist where Caruso had grabbed her, her hair half out of its tie, in the way that meant she'd been running her hand through it without realizing, which she did when she was frightened. She ran hot water and put her face in her hands and stood there until her breathing evened out, until her pulse dropped below the range where she could feel it in her throat. She thought about Mason. Mason at 17, standing in the parking lot of their high school in Pilsen with a black eye and that grin he had that meant he knew exactly how bad the situation was and had decided not to care. Mason at 21, calling her from a casino in Indiana at 3 a.m. because he'd won $400 and needed her to be excited about it with him. Mason at 23, sitting across from her at a diner booth, turning his coffee cup in circles on the table and not quite meeting her eyes and saying, "I got into something, Cy. It's fine. I can handle it." She pressed her hands flat against the sink. She was not going to fall apart in Damian Moretti's bathroom. She cleaned her face and found a plain gray t-shirt and sweatpants in the second room, folded, new tags removed, her size approximately right. And she lay down on the bed in that room and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. At 6:15 in the morning, she heard voices. She came out into the main space to find two men she hadn't seen before seated at the kitchen island with Damian, who was already dressed and drinking coffee and had apparently not slept at all. The two men stopped talking when she appeared. One of them, compact, dark-haired, maybe 45, with a face that had been rearranged a few times and settled into something that looked like permanent mild aggression, looked at her with an expression she could only describe as the look of a person cataloging a problem they hadn't anticipated. "This is Marco," Damian said, indicating the compact man. "And Eli." Marco nodded, said nothing. Eli, younger, quieter, with the very still quality of someone who had trained themselves out of unnecessary movement, gave her a brief look and went back to the documents on the island in front of him. "Sit down," Damian said. She sat at the far end of the island. He poured her coffee without asking and slid it across, and then he said, without preface, "Mason is alive." She put her hand around the coffee cup. "He's being held at a facility in Cicero, a Salazar cartel operation. He's been there for approximately 3 weeks. He paused. "He's not unharmed." "What does that mean?" "It means they've been using him." Damian said it evenly, the way you say things that are true and terrible and require saying regardless. He had information about certain courier routes through the south side, routes the cartel wanted access to. They've been persuading him to provide details. The word persuading sat in her stomach like a stone. "Why haven't you—" She stopped. She'd been about to ask why he hadn't done anything, which was a question built on the assumption that Mason's situation was something Damian Moretti had known about and chosen to ignore, which probably wasn't accurate and also wasn't her business. She didn't know this man. She'd known him for less than 8 hours. "Why is Mason connected to cartel routes?" she asked instead. Marco and Eli both looked at Damien. Damien looked at Sienna. "Your brother has been running small jobs for low-level associates of mine for about 2 years," he said. "Nothing major, delivery, occasionally transportation. He was paid well and told explicitly not to gamble the money." A brief pause. "He gambled the money." She closed her eyes, opened them. "He's been working for you." "Peripherally. And now the cartel has him because of connections he made through your organization." "Through his own decisions," Damien said, and the distinction in his voice was clear without being harsh. "Mason made choices. I didn't make them for him. But he's there because of routes your people use." "Yes." She looked at the coffee cup. The ceramic was warm against her palms. Outside the windows, the lake was gray-green in the early morning light, and a container ship was visible far out, moving slowly toward the southern port, and the whole city was waking up the way it always did, indifferent and relentless and unaware that any of this was happening. "I want him out," she said. "I know." "When?" Damien looked at Marco. Some exchange passed between them, wordless, the kind of communication built over years of working in proximity to each other's thinking. "There are complications," Marco said. His voice was flat and had a slight south side roughness to it that hadn't been ironed out. "The Cicero facility isn't just a holding location. Salazar's been using it as a transit hub, moving product, personnel, information. It's occupied. Hitting it without intelligence on current occupancy is how you start a war in the middle of a residential neighborhood." "So get the intelligence," Sienna said. Marco looked at her the way adults look at children who have said something that demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how things work. "We're working on it," Damien said, and the flatness in his voice was a door being politely closed. She understood the door. She also understood that Mason had been in that facility for 3 weeks and had not been unharmed, and that the kind of persuasion the cartel used on people tended to have a timeline before it stopped mattering whether the information was extracted or not. "How long does he have?" she said. Neither man answered, which was itself an answer. She got up and took her coffee to the window and stood there looking at the lake, and breathed slowly through her nose and thought very carefully about what she was going to say next and how she was going to say it, because she was in a room with 2 men who operated on a logic of force and resource and strategic patience, and none of those were things she had, but she had been working rooms full of men like this for years, and she knew the one currency that moved them faster than anything else, information they didn't already have. "Mason called me," she said, 7 weeks ago, before he disappeared. Damien turned slightly. "He said he'd found something. He was excited about it, which was bad because Mason being excited about something usually meant he'd done something stupid." She kept looking at the lake. "He said he'd found records, financial routing, payments going to addresses that didn't make sense for the business they were supposed to represent." She paused. "He said some of the addresses traced back to City Hall." The room was quiet. She turned around. Both men were watching her now with a quality of attention that was different from before. Sharper, more specific, the way a conversation changes when someone says the thing that matters. "He said he was going to do something with it," she said. "I told him to leave it alone. He didn't call back after that." Damien looked at Marco. Marco looked at Eli. Eli was already on his phone. "What kind of records?" Damien said. "I don't know. He was vague. He said financial routing and City Hall, and then the call cut out, and I thought it was his battery because his phone was always dying." She set her coffee cup on the window ledge. "But now I think maybe it wasn't the battery." Damien was quiet for a moment. Something was moving behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, more the look of a man arranging new information into an existing picture and finding that the arrangement created a shape he recognized. "The Salazar cartel has been in Chicago for 18 months, he said slowly, "moving faster than they should be able to, more intelligence than they should have, protection they shouldn't be able to purchase." He stopped. "Someone's covering for them," Sienna said. "It's been assumed. The source hasn't been confirmed." He looked at her steadily. "What Mason found might be the thread." "Then get him out," she said, "so he can tell you where he found it." Damien held her gaze for what felt like a long time. "It's not that simple," he said. "I know it's not simple. I'm telling you, it's worth the complication." Marco shifted on his stool. We don't go into Cicero without full intel. That's not caution, that's math. You send a team in blind, you don't get the asset out, and you lose the team. I understand that, Sienna said. I'm not sure you... I've been working for tips in a room full of men who carry guns since I was 21, she said, and her voice came out harder than she intended. Harder than she usually allowed herself. The kind of hard that came from years of being talked to, like she needed things simplified. I understand risk math. I'm telling you the information Mason has might be worth more to you than whatever the extraction costs. She looked at Damien. I'm telling you to consider whether that changes your timeline. Marco looked at Damien. Damien said, She's right. Marco put his hands flat on the island. Damien, get me the occupancy numbers on Cicero. Full personnel count, shift rotations, entry points. I want it by noon. He picked up his coffee. And find out who Mason Vale worked with directly. I want everyone in that chain interviewed today. Marco stood. He looked at Sienna once more. Not hostile, just that cataloging look again, like he was revising the file. And then he and Eli left through the elevator with the documents. The penthouse was quiet. Damien put his cup down and looked at her across the kitchen island. You should eat something, he said. I'm not hungry. Eat anyway. She stayed at the window. Why? Because you're going to need to think clearly in the next 24 hours, and thinking clearly requires glucose. He opened the refrigerator. And because standing at a window looking at the lake doesn't get your brother out any faster. She turned around. He was pulling things out with the economy of motion of someone who cooked, not because they enjoyed it, but because they'd learned long ago that paying other people to do it created dependencies. She watched him move around the kitchen, the careful, automatic competence of it, and felt something strange move through her, something she immediately didn't trust. She sat down at the island. What did you do? She said. Before this? He glanced at her. Before what? Before you were whoever you are now. A long pause. He cracked eggs into a pan without looking at them. I was exactly who I am now, he said, just younger and worse at it. Who taught you? My father. What happened to him? The eggs moved in the pan. He watched them. He made a decision I wouldn't have made, he said. He didn't survive it. She didn't push. There was a wall in his voice that wasn't defensive, just structural. The kind that had been built slowly and with purpose and wasn't coming down for curiosity. He put a plate in front of her. She ate. He watched the lake. They existed in the same space without speaking for a while, and it wasn't comfortable exactly, but it wasn't uncomfortable either. It was something more specific than that. The particular quality of a shared silence between two people who are both very used to being alone and are still calibrating what to do with the fact that they're not. The call came at 11:43. Damien took it in the other room. His voice dropped low enough that she couldn't make out words, only cadence, even, controlled, with one brief spike upward that lasted a second and then leveled back out. The kind of spike that meant something had changed and the change required adjustment. When he came back out, his face was the same, but his eyes weren't. What happened? She said immediately. He stood by the window. The lake was turning rougher under a wind that had come up off the north. Small whitecaps visible even at this height. 2 of my businesses were hit last night, he said, after Velvet Room. A warehouse on the south side and a restaurant in Wicker Park. He paused. And one of my safe houses in Logan Square was burned. The cartel. Yes. That's fast. Yes. He turned from the window. It means they knew about the Wabash operation before it happened. They had contingency responses already staged. He said the next part without inflection. There's a leak. She sat with that. Someone in your organization. Someone close enough to have operational knowledge. He said it without visible emotion, which was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. Not a foot soldier, someone in the chain. Do you know who? I have suspicions. He moved to the desk on the far wall and opened a laptop. Suspicions are not evidence. Acting on suspicion without evidence is how empires fall apart from the inside. She watched him sit down at the desk and work with the focused precision of a man who had trained himself to separate feeling from function. She thought about what it cost to do that. what it wore down in a person over time. You trusted everyone in that chain, she said. I trust the work, not the people. That's not true, she said, or you wouldn't care that one of them is leaking. He stopped typing, didn't look up. I care because it's a strategic vulnerability, he said. No, you care because someone you gave something to used it wrong. She paused. That's not strategy. That's personal. He looked up at her then, the gray eyes level and very still. You don't know me, he said. I've been watching people in rooms for 4 years, she said. I know when someone's pretending the thing that's hurting them isn't hurting them. Something shifted in his face. Brief and quickly gone, and then he was back to the controlled flatness. But she'd seen it, and he knew she'd seen it, and for a moment the room held that knowledge between them like something breakable. He looked back at the laptop. Get some rest, he said. Tonight's going to move fast. She should have listened. Instead, she was still awake at 3 in the afternoon when Marco came back up with Eli and another man she hadn't seen before. Older, silver-haired, the kind of bearing that suggested military or law enforcement or both. And the three of them spread documents across the kitchen island and talked to Damien in low voices with a quality of urgency that was different from the mornings. She stayed at the end of the island and listened. The Cicero facility had a higher occupancy than anticipated. 15 personnel confirmed, possibly more. 2 entry points. A basement level that hadn't appeared in any existing records of the building and had been identified through thermal imaging that Eli had arranged through a contact at a federal agency whose name was not mentioned. Mason Vale was in the basement. Condition? Damien asked. Eli looked at his papers. Ambulatory, responding to verbal commands from captors. He paused. Respond suggests conscious and compliant. Sienna kept her hands flat on the island, pressed the surface and felt the stone edge of the counter and let the physical sensation do the work her mind needed done. Extraction window? Damien asked. Tomorrow night, the silver-haired man said. There's a personnel rotation at 2200, 15-minute window where coverage drops to 4 inside, 2 on the perimeter. That's the seam. Who's running perimeter? Salazar's Chicago men, not cartel veterans, hired local. Different, Marco said. Yes. Damien looked at the floor plan spread across the island. He was quiet for a moment, studying it, and Sienna watched his eyes move across the paper with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had done this kind of planning many times and understood that the details you missed in the planning were the ones that killed people in the execution. Run it twice, he said finally. 2 teams. Primary extraction through the north entry, secondary positioned at the basement access point in case primary is compromised. He looked up. I'm going with the primary team. Marco said, No. Damien looked at him. You don't run extraction, Marco said. That's what the teams are for. The basement level is uncharted. We don't know what's down there beyond Mason. I want eyes on it. Then send Eli. I'm sending Eli and I'm going. His voice had the particular quality of a decision that was finished, not a position that was open. Get the teams briefed. Marco looked at him for a long moment. Then, this girl has you making different decisions. The room went very still. Damien said nothing. A week ago, Marco said, keeping his voice even and low, you'd have sent 2 teams and waited for the report. Now you're going in personally on a basement extraction for a peripheral associate who made bad choices. He didn't look at Sienna. He kept his eyes on Damien. That's a different kind of decision. Are you done? Damien said. I'm making sure you know what you're... Are you done? Marco closed the documents in front of him, picked them up. Teams brief at 1800, he said, and walked to the elevator. Eli and the silver-haired man followed. The elevator closed. Damien stood at the island for a moment, looking at the floor plan. Then he folded it with careful, precise movements and set it aside. Sienna said, He's right. Damien looked at her. I'm making you change how you operate. She held his gaze. I've been here one day and you're already running a personal extraction. I've made the decision, he said. I know, I'm telling you Marco's right. I know he is. He picked up his phone. It doesn't change the decision. She stared at him. Why? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming in flat and gray off the lake, and it made everything in the room look very clear, very specific, each object and surface with its own precise existence, and his face in that light was tired in a way she hadn't noticed before. Not the tiredness of a person who needed sleep, but the deeper weariness of someone who had been managing the weight of being themselves for a very long time. "Because your brother has information that might tell me who in my organization is feeding the cartel," he said, "and I want to hear it myself, directly." He paused. "That's the strategic reason." "And the other reason?" He didn't answer. She didn't push. But the non-answer was itself a shape, and she could see its edges, and she was not sure yet what to do with what she saw. She went to the window. The lake was fully rough now, whitecaps rolling in long ridges toward the shore, the container ship gone, the horizon gray and indistinct where water met sky. She thought, tomorrow night. She thought about Mason in a basement in Cicero, 3 weeks of persuasion, responding to verbal commands. She thought about the records he'd found and the thread Damien thought they represented, and the person somewhere in Damien's organization who had already burned 3 properties and staged contingency attacks in the time it had taken her to eat breakfast and learn the shape of this penthouse. She thought about the leak, and she thought about something that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the morning, something small and specific and wrong-shaped that she hadn't found the right angle on yet, a detail in the sequence of the night before that didn't fit the pattern. The way Caruso's men had reacted when they heard the name Moretti. Not just fear. Something more specific than fear. Prepared fear. Like they'd been told to expect it. Like someone had told them, if this goes wrong, this is what comes through the door. She turned from the window. "Damien," she said. He was on the phone. He held up one finger without looking at her, the universal gesture of 1 minute. And kept talking, low and fast, coordinating something with someone. She waited. And while she waited, the thought finished assembling itself in her mind. And when it was complete, it was cold and very clear, and she understood that the timeline she'd been operating on, get Mason, find the leak, end the threat, was not the actual timeline. Because if someone in Damien's organization had staged cartel contingencies before the Velvet Room operation even concluded, then the leak wasn't passive. Wasn't just information being passed. The leak was being directed. Someone was managing the cartel's response to Damien's moves in real time. And if that was true, then the extraction tomorrow night... Her breath stopped. If the leak was close enough to have operational knowledge, she looked at Damien's back, at the careful, contained way he held himself on the phone, at the trust she'd watched him extend to Marco and Eli and the silver-haired man this afternoon. The specific trust of a man who had learned not to trust people but trusted the people in front of him anyway, because there was no other way to function. The extraction tomorrow night was already being heard, by whoever was on the other side of the wall. She crossed the room fast and put her hand on Damien's arm. He turned, sharp, the phone dropping from his ear slightly. She held his gaze and said very quietly, "Don't brief the full team tonight." His eyes narrowed. "Tell me why," he said, and she told him, and watched his face go through something she hadn't seen on it yet. Not anger, not calculation, but something beneath both of those, something that lived in the basement of a person's composure where the walls are thinnest. The phone was still in his hand. He ended the call without looking at it. The room was very quiet. He said, "If you're right." "I know," she said. "Then someone I've known for..." He stopped. His jaw tightened once, released. "Then everything I've planned for tomorrow night is already compromised." "Yes." Outside, the lake moved the way it always moved, indifferent and enormous, and the city went on beneath them in its relentless, unsentimental way, and in the silence of the 38th floor, something that had been approaching from the beginning finally arrived. There was no version of tomorrow night that didn't require knowing who was in the wall. And the only way to find out was to set something on fire and see who ran toward it. Damien turned to the window. "I need you to do something," he said. She already knew she was going to say yes. She didn't know yet how much it would cost. The plan was simple, the way traps are simple. Damien would brief the extraction to a partial team, Marco, Eli, and 2 field lieutenants named Reyes and Carr. The real team, 6 men Damien had pulled from a separate operational cell that existed outside the main organization's knowledge, would stage independently and move on Damien's direct signal. The brief team would receive accurate information about the target location and the timing window. They would receive nothing about the secondary team's existence. If the Cicero facility went on alert before the extraction window opened, they would know the partial team contained the leak. If the operation ran clean, the leak was elsewhere. Simple. Brutal. The kind of plan that used people as instruments of detection without telling them they were being used. Sienna had understood this when she agreed to it. She'd agreed anyway. What Damien needed from her was the performance of normalcy. She would be present at the partial team briefing at 1800. She would ask questions that demonstrated she had operational knowledge, enough to make whoever was listening understand that she was embedded, that she had access, that she was worth monitoring. She would be the thing that drew attention while Damien positioned the real pieces. "You're using yourself as bait," Damien had said, and it wasn't a question, it was a clarification. "I was bait the moment Caruso locked that door," she'd said. "At least this time I know it." He'd looked at her for a long time after that, the gray eyes doing that thing they did, reading past the surface, looking for the thing underneath the statement, the fear or the angle or the calculation. She'd held the look and let him find whatever was there. What was there was simpler than he probably expected. She was tired of being the person things happened to. The briefing took place at 1800 in a conference room 2 floors below the penthouse, a spare space with a long table and a screen and no windows, and the particular airless quality of rooms where serious men discuss serious things. Marco sat at Damien's right, Eli across from him. Reyes and Carr at the far end, both somewhere in their mid-30s, both with the specific physical economy of men who had spent years making themselves hard to read. Sienna sat at the corner, not at the table exactly, adjacent to it, which she'd arranged deliberately. Present, but not central. Observable without being the subject. Damien walked through the floor plan. Entry points, timing, personnel count, Mason's location in the basement. He spoke with the flat precision of someone who had given briefings for 20 years. No wasted words, no dramatizing, just the geometry of the operation laid out in sequence. Sienna watched the faces at the table while he talked. Marco watched the floor plan. His expression was the expression of a man who disagreed with the fundamental decision, but had accepted that the decision was made and was now in execution mode. Clean, readable. Eli took notes, eyes down, efficient. Reyes asked 2 questions. Good questions, tactical, specific, the kind that demonstrated genuine operational thinking and not performance. Carr said almost nothing. He sat with his forearms on the table and his hands loose and his face arranged in careful neutrality. And twice in 40 minutes, Sienna caught his eyes moving to her and then away. Not the way men in rooms look at women in rooms. Something more specific. Something that was trying not to be caught doing what it was doing. She kept her face empty. After the briefing, in the elevator back to the penthouse, she told Damien. "Carr," she said. He said nothing. The elevator moved. "He looked at me twice," she said. "Not the plan. Me. Like he was measuring how much I knew." "That could be... It's not. You know it's not." She turned to face him in the elevator. "You saw it too." He stared at the elevator doors. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "I saw it," he said. "So what do we do?" "Nothing yet. We let it run. And if he tips off the facility tonight, then we know." He looked at her. "And we adjust." She understood the word adjust. She understood what it meant in the vocabulary of a man like Damien Moretti. She didn't say anything else until the elevator opened. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on the bed in the second room and listened to the sounds of the penthouse, the distant hum of the building's systems, wind off the lake flexing against the glass, once the low murmur of Damien's voice somewhere down the hall taking a call at 2 a.m, and she thought about Carr's face during the briefing, the quality of the neutrality on it, the effort required to maintain it. She thought about what a person looks like when they are keeping a secret in a room full of people who mustn't know they have it. She knew that look. She'd worn it herself, working Velvet Room, carrying information about what certain customers were doing in certain booths that she'd learned to keep strictly behind her eyes, because knowing things about powerful men and letting them know you knew was the fastest route to a very specific kind of trouble. She knew what Carr's face had been doing. It had been doing the same thing. At 5 in the morning, she got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the east window and watched the lake go from black to gray to a thin, washed-out blue as the sun came up somewhere behind the cloud cover, never actually appearing, just lightening the sky from dark to pale the way certain changes happen. Not through a clear moment of transition, but through the slow accumulation of small differences, until you notice that everything has changed without being able to point to when. Damien came out at 5:30. He looked at her at the window and then at the coffee pot and poured a cup and stood at the island. Carr made a call at 2300, he said. She turned. Eli traced the number, prepaid, active for 6 days, purchased in Cicero. He drank. The call lasted 4 minutes. She put her cup down on the window ledge. 4 minutes is long, she said. Long enough? He looked at the countertop. I've known Thomas Carr for 7 years. He ran protection on 3 of my properties. I put his son through college. She said nothing. 7 years, he said again, and the repetition wasn't for her. She understood that. It was the sound of a man pressing on something to confirm it hurt. What happens to him? She said carefully. Damien looked up. Nothing that concerns you. It concerns me if it changes the timeline for Mason. It doesn't change the timeline. He set the cup down. It changes the plan. Carr was assigned to North Entry on the primary team. That position is now compromised. I'm shifting Reyes to North Entry and pulling Carr from the operation with a cover reason. He said it with the brisk efficiency of a chess player describing a forced rearrangement. He'll be detained quietly before 1800 tonight. And if he's already told them everything? He hasn't told them everything, Damien said, because everything includes the secondary team, and he doesn't know about the secondary team. She picked her cup back up. The lake was fully lit now in its pale, cloud-filtered way, the water still rough from yesterday's wind, and a line of pelicans was moving north along the shore in that effortless formation they kept even in rough weather, each bird riding the updraft off the one ahead, the whole line connected by invisible physics. There's something else, she said. He looked at her. Carr knew about the briefing, she said. He knew the timing, the location. He knew enough to make a 4-minute call. She turned from the window. That means he knew about the operation before the briefing. Damien was very still. Which means the decision to extract Mason, the decision you made yesterday morning, was already known. She watched his face. How many people knew you were considering an extraction before the 1800 briefing? The stillness in him deepened. Marco, he said slowly. Eli, the silver-haired man. His name is Pilar. And Carr, because he was in the room when Pilar presented the thermal imaging. 4 people. Yes. And Carr was one of them. Yes. She watched him work through it. Not the conclusion, he was already there, but the implications spreading out from it. The web of what Carr knowing that early meant about what else Carr might know, and how long Carr had been knowing it, and what had already moved through that channel before last night's call. How long? She said quietly. He looked at her. How long do you think he's been feeding them? Damien picked up his cup, set it back down without drinking. Long enough, he said, and the 2 words carried the specific weight of a man understanding the full geometry of a betrayal he'd been living inside without knowing it. They moved early. At 1400, Damien had Carr brought up to the penthouse on the pretext of a pre-operation walkthrough. Carr came in looking professional and prepared and mildly curious, the leather jacket and the careful face and the hands that he kept very still at his sides. He looked at Damien and then at Sienna, and his eyes moved over her in that measuring way again, quicker this time, less controlled. The involuntary flicker of a man recalibrating in real time because something was wrong with the configuration of the room and he couldn't yet identify what. Eli was by the elevator. 2 men Sienna hadn't seen before stood near the terrace door. Carr understood the room in about 3 seconds. Sit down, Tom, Damien said. Carr sat. He put his hands on his knees and looked at Damien with the careful blankness of a man deciding what he knows and what he's willing to admit to knowing. I need to talk to you about the call you made last night, Damien said. No preamble, no softening, just the fact, placed on the table between them like a stone. Carr's face didn't break. She had to give him that. The blankness held for a full 2 seconds before something shifted in it. Not guilt, not fear, something more complicated, something that looked like a man arriving at a decision he'd been postponing for a long time and finding it was simpler than he'd expected now that it was here. "All right," Carr said. Damien looked at him. "All right," Carr said again. "How much do you know?" "Tell me how much there is." Carr looked at his hands. He was quiet for a moment. Then, 14 months. The number landed in the room. Damien didn't move, didn't make a sound, just looked at Carr with those gray eyes that had gone very flat and very cold. 14 months, he said. "Yes." "That's—" Damien stopped, recalibrated. "The warehouse fire in August. The South Side route disruption in the spring. The Pilsen operation." "Yes." "All of it. Most of it." Sienna watched Damien's hands on the kitchen island. They were flat and perfectly still. The stillness that cost something. The stillness of a man holding something down with everything he had. "Why?" Damien said. Carr raised his eyes. "My son." "I put your son through—" "They put his name on a list," Carr said, and his voice was raw in a way that the neutral face hadn't prepared her for. "Before you put him through college, before any of that. They put his name on a list and told me what would happen to him if I didn't cooperate." He pressed his hands hard into his knees. "He was 19. He'd never done anything wrong. He didn't even know what I did for a living." The room was silent. "You had options," Damien said. "I had a son," Carr said. "Everything else was a variable." Something moved through Damien's face, something that was not quite sympathy and was not quite understanding, and lived in the difficult space between a man's judgment and his capacity to imagine what he might do in the same position. Then it closed. The face went back to flat. "The Cicero facility," Damien said. "Your call last night. What did you tell them?" "The timing, the entry point, primary team composition." "The basement access." "Yes." "Mason Vale." Carr hesitated. "I told them you were extracting an asset from the basement. I didn't give a name. It's enough." Damien looked at the window for a moment. "What's their response protocol when they receive advance warning of an extraction attempt?" Carr said, "They move the asset." The words detonated in the room silently, without sound, the way certain revelations do. Not with noise, but with a sudden restructuring of everything that had seemed solid. Sienna stood up from the far end of the island. "They move him," she said. Carr didn't look at her. "Standard protocol. If the facility is compromised in advance, assets are transferred to a secondary location." "Where?" Damien said. "I don't know the secondary." "You've been feeding them for 14 months and you don't—" "They compartmentalize," Carr said, and now there was something defensive and ragged in his voice. "I got what was in my lane. I didn't get architecture. I got operational details as they were relevant to what I had access to. I don't know secondary sites." Damien looked at Eli. Eli was already on his phone. Sienna crossed the room. She didn't think about it. She crossed it in about 6 steps and stood in front of Carr, and he looked up at her with that exhausted, stripped-down face, and she looked back at him and said, "How long ago did you make the call?" "Last night, 2300. "Have they moved him yet?" "Have they moved him yet?" "I don't know their timeline." Carr's voice was tight. "If they followed standard protocol, they'd move within 12 hours of the alert." She looked at the clock on the wall behind him. 14 hours had passed since 2300. She turned and looked at Damien. He was already looking at her. "Get your coat," he said. The drive to Cicero took 22 minutes. Damien, Sienna, Eli, and 4 men from the secondary team, the real team, the one Carr hadn't known about, moved in 2 vehicles through afternoon traffic, and the city did its indifferent thing around them, the ordinary Tuesday of it, school buses and food carts, and a man arguing with a parking meter on Ogden Avenue with the committed passion of someone who still believed in the possibility of winning. The facility on Cicero Avenue was a former light industrial building, 2 stories, brick, with a loading dock on the south side that had been converted to a private entrance, and a ground-level window arrangement that had been partially bricked in at some point. From the outside, it looked like a dozen other buildings on that block. Faded commercial, quietly purposeless. The kind of structure that becomes invisible through sheer ordinariness. They parked half a block east. Eli was watching a tablet running the thermal feed. 2 heat signatures on the main floor, he said. Basement is... He stopped. What? Damien said. Basement is cold. The word hit her like ice water. Cold means empty, she said. Cold means no body heat detected, Eli said carefully, which means either the space is unoccupied or there's shielding. I'm not penetrating. He looked at Damien. They could have moved him, or they could have added insulation to the basement after the thermal was run yesterday. Or he's dead, she said. Sienna, that's a possibility. Say it. Eli looked at Damien. Damien said nothing. She opened the car door. Wait, Damien said. You have 2 people on the main floor in a cold basement, she said. If they're still here, it's because they're waiting for something. If Mason's still here, it's because the transfer got delayed. She held Damien's gaze across the car. Every minute we sit here is a minute they have to complete whatever they're doing. Damien was quiet for 3 seconds. Stay behind the team, he said. They went in through the loading dock. It took less than 4 minutes to clear the main floor. The 2 heat signatures turned out to be a man eating a sandwich at a folding table who didn't survive the next 10 seconds, and a second man in a back room who made a decision that was incorrect and permanent. The building smelled of damp concrete and industrial solvent, and something else underneath, metallic, organic, the smell of a space where bad things had been done and inadequately cleaned up. The basement stairs were at the back. Damien went down first. Then Sienna. One of the team members grabbed her arm, and she shook him off, and he looked at Damien, and Damien let her go. The basement was a long, low room with exposed concrete walls and a drain in the center of the floor and fluorescent lights that ran in strips across the ceiling. 2 of the 4 strips dead, the remaining 2 casting a flat bluish light that made everything look like evidence. There was a metal table, 2 chairs, chains anchored to the far wall. Empty. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the room and felt the full weight of the empty chairs and the cold concrete and the chains that moved slightly in the draft from the open stairwell. He was already gone. She heard herself make a sound. Not words, just a sound, short and involuntary, that came from somewhere below the level of decision. Damien was beside her. He didn't touch her. He looked at the room with those flat gray eyes doing their reading thing, moving across surfaces, cataloging. There, Eli said. He was at the metal table. A phone, cracked screen, case held together with black tape. He held it up. Burner, he said. Probably left in a hurry. He powered it on. The screen was cracked badly enough that the right third of the display was dead, but the left 2/3 showed a home screen and Eli went through it fast. Thumb moving with practiced efficiency. Last outgoing call, he said. 14 minutes ago. He read off an address. Damien looked at his men. Go. They went back up the stairs, fast, and she went with them, and outside the afternoon had gone darker under a new front moving in off the lake, the sky pressing down low and the air carrying the metal smell of incoming rain. And they were in the vehicles and moving before she'd fully processed the shift from stillness to motion. 14 minutes. The call had been 14 minutes ago. They were 14 minutes behind. In the back of the SUV, she sat beside Damien, and her hands were doing the shaking thing again, and she pressed them flat on her thighs and breathed the way she'd taught herself to breathe in bad rooms. Through the nose, slow, filling from the bottom, holding 2 counts, releasing. And she looked at the city moving past the windows and thought about the basement, the empty chains, the drain in the center of the floor with its rust-brown residue. He's alive, Damien said. She looked at him. The call from that phone was operational, he said. You don't make operational calls about a dead asset. She held on to that. Eli read the address again. A warehouse in Bridgeport, 7 minutes. The warehouse came up fast, larger than the Cicero facility, set back from the street behind a chain-link fence, the kind of warehouse that had originally served the stockyards a century ago and had been repurposed several times over the decades, and now served whatever purpose paid the most and asked the fewest questions. 3 vehicles parked outside the fence. Lights on in the upper windows. Active. Occupied. Damien's team moved with a different quality now. Not the methodical efficiency of the Cicero building, but something sharper, more aggressive. The adjustment of a plan accelerating past its intended parameters. She watched them go over the fence and felt the particular helplessness of standing outside something that was happening without her. And then Damien was beside her, and he had her arm, not grabbing, not restraining, a different kind of contact. And he said, "Wait here." "No." "Sienna, he's my brother." She looked at him. "I'm going in." He held her gaze. His hand on her arm was very still. "Stay directly behind me," he said. "If I tell you down, you're on the floor before the word is finished. Understand?" "Yes." They went over the fence. The inside of the warehouse was organized around cargo, crates stacked high on both sides, creating corridors that the team moved through in pairs, fast and low, clearing the geometry with the practiced choreography of people who had done this many times before and understood that hesitation in confined spaces was the same as a decision to die. Sienna moved directly behind Damien. She was aware of her own breathing. Too loud. She was sure of it. A liability, but she kept it as controlled as she could and kept her eyes on Damien's back and matched his pace exactly. The sounds reached them before the scene did. Voices. Two men, speaking in rapid Spanish, and under the voices a third sound, lower and irregular, that took her a moment to identify and then landed on her like a physical blow when she did. Someone was coughing, a wet, effortful cough. The kind that came from ribs that had been compromised. They turned the corner of the last cargo corridor and the space opened up. 4 men, a folding table, light strung from the ceiling, and in a chair in the center of the space, zip-tied at the wrists and ankles, head down, wearing what had probably been a gray t-shirt 3 weeks ago and was now a documentation of everything that had happened to him, Mason. Her body moved before her mind did. She was already stepping forward when Damien's arm came across her chest, and the next 4 seconds happened the way those seconds always happen, in a compression of sound and motion and aftermath that the mind records incompletely and rearranges in memory later into a sequence that feels more linear than it was. When it was over, the 4 men were down and the warehouse was quiet except for the coughing and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside, a bus going by, a horn, Chicago making its indifferent noise. She crossed the space to her brother. Up close, Mason Vale was almost unrecognizable, not because of the injuries, though those were extensive and made her hands curl and her stomach contract when she catalogued them, but because of his face, which was the face of a person who had been somewhere very far from ordinary human experience and was only partially returned. His eyes, when he raised his head, were too flat, too careful, the eyes of someone who had learned over the past weeks that reactions invited consequences. Then he saw her. Something broke open in his face, just briefly, just a flash of it. The Mason she knew, the grin and the recklessness and the specific quality of his hope, always slightly larger than the situation warranted. And then it was gone, folded back under the careful flatness, because 3 weeks had taught his body that feeling things was dangerous. "Sigh," he said. His voice was barely there. She cut the zip ties with a knife one of Damien's men handed her. Her hands were shaking again. "I've got you," she said. "I've got you. You're okay." "I told them," he coughed. "I told them nothing. I want you to know I told them." "I know. Stop talking. The records. I put them somewhere. I need to tell Damien." He looked up and saw Damien standing behind her, and something moved through his battered face. Not fear exactly, something more complicated, the expression of a man confronting the particular intersection of his mistakes. "Mason," Damien said, "the records can wait." "No," Mason said. "They can't." He looked at his sister, then back at Damien. "I found payment routing from a City Hall address to a Salazar front company. 6 months of transactions." He swallowed. The swallowing cost him something. "The City Hall address, it's registered to a holding company. I traced the holding company." He stopped, coughed again, wet and grinding. "It's registered to someone in your organization, Damien. Someone who's been there a long time. The warehouse was very quiet. Who? Damien said. Mason looked at him. Luca Bernardi, he said. The name sat in the air. Sienna didn't know it, but she knew how it landed on Damien's face. The specific way it landed, the controlled collapse of something, the particular expression of a man who has just had the last version of a story he'd been telling himself taken from him permanently. Damien stood with his hands at his sides and looked at Mason and said nothing for a long moment. Luca has been with me for 15 years, he said finally. I know, Mason said. I saw the dates on the payments. They go back 22 months. He looked at Damien carefully, reading his face with the particular sensitivity of a man who had spent weeks learning to read faces for survival. It's not just money. I found operational documents, route maps, personnel files. A pause, each word costing him breath. He gave them names, Damien. Names of people in your operation. The Cicero facility, the reason they knew to put Mason there, the reason they knew which routes to use, all of it came from documents I found with Luca's authentication codes. Damien turned and walked to the far wall of the warehouse. He put one hand against the brick and stood there with his back to the room. Sienna watched his shoulders. She watched him stand at that wall for a count of maybe 30 seconds, and she understood what was happening in those 30 seconds. Not grief exactly, not rage exactly, but the specific internal reckoning of a man dismantling a structure he'd built his life around and understanding simultaneously that he has to keep standing while he does it, because the alternative is the floor. Then he turned around. His face was composed, completely, frighteningly composed. Get Mason to the medical facility on Halsted, he said to Eli. Full team on security, nobody from the primary briefing list. He looked at Reyes. I want Luca Bernardi located. Don't approach. Don't alert. Just eyes on his position at all times. He looked at Sienna. Your brother is safe. The rest of tonight belongs to something else. She looked at him. What are you going to do? Finish this, he said. Damien. Luca knows the extraction happened, he said. He'll know Carr is detained. He'll know the Cicero facility was compromised. He crossed the space toward the exit, moving with that particular focused motion of a man who has converted something devastating into direction. He has a window to run. I need to close it before he does. And if he runs before you close it? Damien stopped. He turned and looked at her across the warehouse, over her brother's battered form and the evidence of what the last 3 weeks had been. And he said the next words with a quietness that was somehow more total than any amount of volume could have been. Then he takes everything he knows about this organization, every name, every route, every operation, directly to the Salazar cartel leadership. He paused. And Chicago spends the next 2 years in a war that ends with everyone I've ever been responsible for buried in it. She stood in the warehouse light with her brother's hand in hers and looked at Damien Moretti's face and understood for the first time the full geometry of what she'd walked into on South Wabash 3 days ago. Not just a man who answered a phone call, not just a mafia boss with gray eyes and expensive suits, but a person standing at the exact center of something vast and dangerous and 15 years in the building, and the man who had spent 15 years helping him build it had been quietly, systematically handing it to the enemy. And now the only thing standing between the collapse of all of it and whatever came next was the same focused, cold, devastating will that had driven 4 black SUVs down South Wabash at 2 a.m. because a stranger said, "Please hurry." She squeezed her brother's hand once. She stood up. "I'm coming with you," she said. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the rain that had been threatening all day finally arrived. She could hear it on the warehouse roof, building from drops to a downpour in the space of seconds. The way Chicago rain came when it decided to come, without apology, without warning, filling every available surface with the sound of itself. "Sienna," he said, "what's coming next?" "I know what's coming next," she said. "I've known since you said his